Puget Sound is many things to many people. It is the sky, the wind, and the sea which surround us. It is a source of livelihood or recreation. It is a source of unfolding knowledge as nature reveals her secrets. To the tribal peoples, it is an ancestral heritage whose myths and rituals honor profound truths about the relationship of humans to the earth. To all of us who now live on or near its shores, Puget Sound is a source of sustenance and inspiration. It is our heritage and one that we must protect. Today, we risk the loss of this heritage. For years, wastes have been dumped into Puget Sound and into the rivers which feed it, collecting in its bottom sediments, harming and killing the creatures who live there, and in some cases threatening human health. Wetlands and other natural habitats have been destroyed to make room for industry and development. The populations of some animal species have declined drastically, and others carry a toxic legacy of chemical contamination in their cells. The growth of human population in years to come will increase the burden of pollution even more.
Chitons crawl on rocks, and they stick a tongue out of that mouth there and lick seaweed off the rocks.
At the Marine Science Center in Paulsbo, Washington, Karen Maddock teaches basic science concepts to students from western Puget Sound.
Second graders, we try to get them really excited about the marine life and give them an introduction to what's out there and the adaptations that the animals have, how they get their food, how they protect themselves, how they survive out in the saltwater.
Puget Sound is one of the most productive and diverse estuaries in the world. Water from the Pacific Ocean comes through the Strait of Juan de Fuca and enters Puget Sound at Admiralty Inlet, where it pours across a shallow sill and into central and southern Puget Sound, which is up to 900 feet deep. In these basins, carved out by glaciers 13,000 years ago, the outflowing fresh water of rivers meets the incoming tides and marine waters of the sea. The Nooksack, the Dosey Wallops, the Snohomish, the Skagit, the Nisqually. Puget Sound echoes with the native place names of a dozen large rivers and 10,000 streams, which run from the mountains to the sound. The mixing and turbulence of the waters create wide variations in temperature, salinity, and turbidity. Complex and interdependent food webs have evolved to fill the ecological niches provided by geographic features including deep water, intertidal zones, mudflats, sandy beaches, rocky shores, wetlands, and floodplains. Eelgrass, kelp beds, and salt marshes provide food and shelter for creatures from plankton to salmon to seals. These waters provide good hunting for the science sleuths in Karen Maddock's classes.
As they get up through older levels in elementary school, they look at how humans affect marine life, how we collect shellfish, the different kinds of rules there are. They look at oil pollution. In sixth grade, they look at microscopic marine life and start looking at food webs and how humans affect those food webs. And then finally they get up to high school, and at the advanced level they may be doing water quality monitoring and actually testing for oxygen in the water and looking at the microscopic life and seeing how it changes and trying to monitor the chemistry in the water as well.
Viking Fest is coming up, and so we're doing a lot of these experiments to see how Viking Fest and all the boats in the water is going to affect the quality of the water. They can dump their waste either over the side of the boat, or they have these dumping stations. And from what we've discussed in class, not many people use the dumping stations, and I think it's really serious because it does cause us a lot of pollution.
As the students at Paulsbo learn about the ecology of Puget Sound, study also goes on at another level. In the late 1970s, bottom fish living in certain areas of Puget Sound were found to have a high incidence of fin rot, liver lesions, and cancerous tumors. Scientists working for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration found that these fish lived in areas where bottom sediments were contaminated with toxic chemicals. But where did these chemicals come from?
There were several chemical plants in the Tacoma area, and before we knew very much about what happened to these chemicals, the assumption was that if they got dumped into the water, they'd just be diluted and they'd go away. So for a long time, there was a large chemical plant here on the Hylebos waterway that barged chemicals out into the middle of the Commencement Bay area and just dumped them. And it was all done by permit, and it was something that we assumed was okay to do.
Toxic chemicals bind to small particles in the water and settle out to become part of the bottom sediments. There they are eaten by bottom-dwelling creatures and passed higher and higher up the food chain. Alarming amounts have been found in marine mammals.
I think our first tests we did were in the mid to late 1970s, and at that time concentrations of PCBs and DDT, the more stable, persistent chemicals that can concentrate up food chains, were in very high concentrations in the blubber of seals, so high that they would be toxic for human consumption, and they rivaled some of the upper levels found elsewhere in the world.
Besides dumping, the main sources of toxic chemicals in Puget Sound have historically been industrial discharges and municipal sewage discharges. These sources are called point source pollution because the discharges occur at a specific point. Every day, more than 900 million gallons of wastewater are discharged by about 1,000 permitted discharges into Puget Sound, equal to the entire flow of the Duwamish, one of the Sound's major rivers. There are probably another 9,000 dischargers waiting for permits which have not yet been written, and illegal dumping is still a problem. Toxic contamination is usually worst around urban bays and waterways near points of discharge. Often, chemicals are concentrated in so-called hotspots, which can be devastating to marine life.
One of the things we first have to do is find out how big of an area it is and what the levels of contamination are. Previous samples that we took were showing some elevated concentrations of copper and mercury, and those are metals, and then the other elements are organic compounds that are combustion products from fuels, and they call those high molecular weight PAHs. By the ferry terminal, they capped an area about 4 acres, and it cost $200,000 to do that. And they put 1.5 feet of clean sand over that site. So it can be quite expensive, and that's one of the cheaper methods. If you have to dredge, then it becomes many times more expensive, and the question is hard to find out, what do you do with contaminated sediment? Where can you put it?
Since prevention is so much cheaper than cleanup, pollution control efforts are stressing source control. Attention is focused on finding non-toxic alternatives to chemicals used in industrial processes. When toxic waste is produced, it is collected and treated before it is released to the environment. This approach has seen some chemicals banned altogether as too harmful to the environment.
More recently, we've been seeing that concentrations of at least PCB and DDT have been declining in seals, and so the protection, legal protection of the environment from banning those chemicals is starting to have a positive effect.
If all pollution came from pipes, then banning certain chemicals and regulating these point sources might solve Puget Sound's problems. But at least half of the watershed's pollution is coming from other sources. Pollutants enter Puget Sound from throughout the 16,000 square mile area that makes up its drainage basin. They come from streets, yards, households, parking lots, open highways, farms, rural countrysides, and even from the air itself. This non-point pollution is much harder to locate and control. It comes from the daily activities of the 3.2 million people who live around Puget Sound. The Puget Sound watershed starts at the crest of the mountains that surround it. Much of the rain that falls in the basin, formed by the Cascades and the Olympic Mountains, makes its way to the Sound, carrying silt, nutrients, and contaminants with it. The erosion of silt from timber harvest and road building can choke streams, smother salmon eggs, and destroy habitat. Agriculture, landscaping, and urban gardens contribute poison runoff from improperly applied pesticides. Nitrates from fertilizers provide large doses of nutrients to organisms in the water, stimulating their growth and choking out other plants and fish. Nature has ways of cleaning water and controlling its flow. Forest soils absorb and hold rainwater. Runoff is filtered in wetlands, which can also soak up excess stormwater and release it gradually to reduce flooding. As we have destroyed wetlands and developed, diked, dammed, and channeled our waterways, these natural cycles have been disrupted.
This is Mill Creek, actually, and in another 2 miles, Mill Creek empties into the Green River, which eventually goes down, obviously, into the Duwamish and then down into Puget Sound. This outfall actually is a storm drain outfall from the city of Auburn, so it's draining parking lots and roadways and lawns, shopping centers, all of the kinds of uses that you'd find in an urban and urbanizing area. So you're getting a range of pollutants, I expect, things from silt and fine sediments to whatever they put on the roadway during the winter, to fertilizers, to pesticides, and then to the more, I guess, toxic things like heavy metals, organic compounds like PAHs and PCBs, only things that were generated from urban systems.
Our millions of vehicles leave behind many products on the highways in the Puget Sound Basin. Each year, more than 3 tons of zinc, a half ton of copper, and more than 8 tons of phosphorus are washed down storm drains from roadways into the Sound. Chronic spills of oil and hazardous substances also have a serious effect. Even air pollution has an impact. Many chemicals settle out of the atmosphere directly onto the water, or are washed down watersheds into the Sound. The wastes of farm animals, pets, marine mammals, and humans add bacteria and pathogens to the waters of the Sound. As a result of bacterial contamination, nearly 1/4 of the commercial and recreational shellfish beds in Puget Sound have been restricted or closed to harvest. Shellfish such as barnacles, clams, and oysters are filter feeders, straining food from the water. Humans are thus connected to the great food webs of Puget Sound when we eat seafood from its waters. The total value of commercial fish and shellfish harvested yearly in Puget Sound is about $168 million. Shellfish can actually thrive with some types of bacterial pollution, but they become unfit for human consumption. Bill Taylor's family has been in the shellfish business near Shelton since the 19th century.
Right off the surface, I've got a very economic interest in clean water. If we don't have clean water, I can't harvest my product out of these waters, and that's how I earn my living, and that's how all my employees earn their living, is the fact that this water is clean. We've had different types of pollution. In the 1920s, a pulp mill came to the town of Shelton. It dumped its effluent into the bay at Shelton, and over a period of about 4 or 5 years, it started to affect the beds here and basically wiped out the Olympia oyster industry. That mill closed a long time ago, and the bays have been coming back, but now we're more of a problem with the bacterial contamination. The people moving into the area definitely have an impact on our water quality. If their septic tanks aren't installed right, if the runoff from their house or from their driveways isn't filtered some way, it all has an impact on the bay. If the animals
wastes aren't handled properly, they'll also impact the water quality in the bay.
Puget Sound seems large enough to tolerate almost any amount of contamination, and its strong tidal currents make it appear that pollutants are rapidly flushed to the ocean. But scientists studying Puget Sound have discovered that shallow sills block the outflow of water, so pollutants become trapped and concentrated within the sound.
Most of the particles of water don't get out on their first try. They get mixed down and they come back, and they go in endless loops, so that it takes an average of several months for an average particle of water to get out of the sound. So it really doesn't flush nearly as fast as you might visualize standing on the beach watching a piece of driftwood. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I grew up in the era when smog developed. And I see Puget Sound now as the beginning of the era of an underwater type of smog, which will result from the relatively slow flushing action of the sound. It's difficult to see, and it'll build up very slowly, but it'll be there.
By the year 2010, the population of the Puget Sound Basin is expected to grow by 1.2 million people, 40% more than the current number. The increase would be more than the 1990 population of Washington State's 10 largest cities. With more people living in the Puget Sound watershed, there will be more garbage, sewage, roads, yards, cars, and septic systems, all potential sources of pollution. In addition to the constant inflow of pollution and the limited flushing capability, much of the Sound's capacity for self-protection and regeneration has been destroyed, especially in the destruction of wetlands. The Sound's estuarine and freshwater wetlands are productive nurseries for juvenile fish and other creatures, and are havens for waterfowl and wading birds. Wetlands also function to store water and prevent floods, and serve as natural filters for particles and pollutants in the process of recharging groundwater. But nearly 60% of Puget Sound's coastal wetlands have been lost. The accumulated effects of pollution and habitat destruction are having serious long-term effects.
So what we've seen is that in fish that are heavily contaminated, the English sole we've looked at, those fish, there is a very high incidence of fish that do not reproduce, and there's a significantly higher percentage than we find in a non-contaminated area. And there's no better way to affect a population than to mess with its reproductive processes.
We don't even know what it takes to make a normal, healthy ecosystem. But we do know that if we remove one or two pieces from a puzzle, the puzzle doesn't make sense. We started seeing, well, the individual's health is affected. Then we find that now they are not able to reproduce, therefore the future generation is affected. So something happens to one species now, does it affect the entire ecosystem? The entire ecosystem, including human beings, we are all connected with each other.
The first salmon ceremony of many Northwest tribal peoples is a ritual which recognizes human dependence on healthy ecosystems. The myth says that the salmon people live in villages under the sea. Each year they send an emissary to see if it is safe for the salmon to swim up their native rivers and streams to reproduce. If the emissary is honored and treated with respect, he will return and bring the hordes of salmon which for centuries have been the staple food of Northwest tribes.
I think the tribes in general, in viewing the 100 years of change that have occurred, are extremely concerned that we've already passed some thresholds in the ecosystem and that we've lost significant pieces that will not be recovered. We've got a whole change in our forest ecology, a whole change in our Puget Sound Delta, and all of that impacts the rivers and the Puget Sound itself. So we don't know today what's going on, and we don't know what it's going to mean in the future. But we do know that if we continue doing what we're doing, we're going to have major or severe problems.
In view of past abuses, our current impacts, and the future implications of population growth and development, how can we best protect Puget Sound?
We need a long-term commitment to Puget Sound. The problems that we're seeing, the kinds of degradation that we see around the Sound didn't happen overnight. They didn't happen 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It's taken a long time, 100 years, to get to the point that we see now. And it's going to take a long-term commitment to address those problems.
I am very pleased to announce that today I'm officially approving the Puget Sound Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan.
The Puget Sound Water Quality Authority was established in 1985 and directed by the Washington State Legislature to write a comprehensive conservation and management plan for Puget Sound. It is the first such plan to be completed for a major estuary in the nation. It is an action plan which seeks solutions in several problem areas.
Plan calls on all the people who live around the Sound in various ways to take particular actions that will help us protect the Sound for the future.
It's going to take governments and industries, and scientists and farmers and other citizens, all working together to preserve this priceless heritage that is Puget Sound. Responsibility starts in the home. A surprising amount of toxic pollution comes from household hazardous wastes, such as paints, solvents, oil and grease, and lawn care chemicals, which can be safely disposed of at special collection events or regional waste centers. They should never be poured down drains or storm sewers, and many municipalities are specially marking storm drains to warn and educate residents. Some industries are also taking the initiative. The Simpson-Tacoma Craft Company in Tacoma has undertaken the first remedial action in the Commencement Bay Superfund site. This voluntary, privately funded cleanup placed clean sediment on contaminated tide flats near the St. Paul waterway in Commencement Bay, restoring shoreline habitat and controlling sources of pollution. In agriculture, good management practices can be implemented on both large and small farms, as demonstrated at the Dobbs Creek Model Farm near Olympia.
This particular farm had a problem in that it was overstocked. First of all, there were more animals on the land than the grass could handle. In addition, there were no fences excluding the animals from the stream. They had full access to the stream corridor, and we ended up with a lot of the cattle spending time in the stream that was their water source. So we had direct deposit of manure into the stream. One of the really important things we did here was put gutters and downspouts on the barns so that we could divert the clean water away from the manure, so that we weren't having clean water washing down into the creek, helping carry the manure down to the creek. So we can keep the manure separate, we can store it so that it can be put out on the fields during the time of year that the grass can use it. All of these things add up to more dollars for the livestock owner, because even though we're doing them for water quality purposes, they're also good management for farms.
Other citizens are also taking an active role through projects like stream cleanups and cleanups of beaches and bays. One of these is the Urban Bay Action Program.
The Urban Bay Action Program is an interagency and citizen effort to identify and address pollution problems in urban bays throughout Puget Sound. And the idea is to involve the community in cleaning up the shorelines and cleaning up the bottom of the bay, and hopefully to foster a sense of environmental awareness so people realize that their individual actions do count.
Beer bottles, pop bottles, plastic buckets. There's a lot of garbage down there. Lawn chairs, fishing gear, fishing line, and I'm concerned about the fishing line. We find the crabs get trapped in it. I'm representing Kitsap Diving Association. Our members are very concerned. We've seen a lot of pollution under the water that people don't normally see, and we're trying to use this Earth Day event as a means of calling attention to the problem, and we hope that people will realize that they should properly dispose of their trash and recycle as much as possible, as opposed to throwing it all in the bay.
It takes about 30 little necks for a sample. So if we get 30 little necks in this bucket, we can call it quits. Pop them into a bag and that'll be our sample. So let's just dig until we get some more clams.
Another example of involvement is citizen monitoring, where people living in an area can also help to care for it.
It's required by law for commercial operators to collect samples every single 2 weeks and send them into the lab. They have to do that to make sure that their shellfish is healthy. But it hasn't been required by law for recreational areas to be monitored on a regular basis. So that's why volunteers are really needed in this program, because there are tons of recreational areas all around Puget Sound. There are private beaches where people, harvest for their own consumption. There are state parks, DNR beaches, you name it. And all these places need to be monitored as well. Adopt a Beach is what I call a citizen stewardship organization. And what we try to do, what we want to do, is get people all over Puget Sound, all over Western Washington, actively involved in projects. And the great thing is that there are many projects, many tasks that need to be done.
The health of Puget Sound depends on taking individual and collective responsibility for our activities. These kindergarten children have raised baby salmon in their classroom and are now sending them downstream to Puget Sound. Already, they are learning that all of us have a part to play in preserving the great cycles of life here in Puget Sound.